Welcome. I think some people are still joining, and we'll continue to let you in here. Nice to see you all again virtually. Thanks for joining. We have Gabriella and JD from OpenUp who are here to conduct a workshop, and we are recording this. So for our friends that can't be here, we're happy to send this along as well. And I'll just kick it over to either JD or Gabriella, whoever would like to kick us off here for the workshop. So we can do some introductions and just jump right in.
Shall I share my screen so long and you can introduce us, Gavin?
Oh, sure. Okay. So I'm Gabriella Razzano. I'm the Executive Director of OpenUp, and JD is JD Bothma, and he's our product lead at OpenUp. And we thought we'd speak a little bit today about some of our experiences in developing collaboratively developing technology in the procurement space. So we currently are the lead developers of National Treasury's open budget data portal called Vulikamali, which has, aspects of procurement data on it. We've done reviews of procurement data and e-procurement technologies in South Africa in partnership with the South African government. And so we thought it might be useful if JD focused a little bit specifically on procurement data and aspects of the procurement data environment. It's obviously South Africa specific, but there'll be some utility there. And then I'll talk very briefly to just introducing some ideas around possible business model questions that we think might be relevant in the space, given, we have, I'll talk a bit about our funding model. But we've done business in the space, and I thought it might be useful. So JD, if you want to go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. It's really cool to be here, and it was really nice to see your pitch deck so far. I think you really nicely laid out your ideas. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of sides to this. The first is Open Contracting Data Standard, which I think is worth all of you being well aware of, and what we've learned from it, and how I think it's best utilized in the space at this stage. And then I'll look at a couple of examples of where we've sought some of this data and tried to do useful things with it. So first of all, what can we learn from the Open Contracting Data Standard? For me, it's a really helpful conceptual structure for the different kinds of information that exist in the space. It lays out the kind of different stages and the different kinds of artifacts that exist at each stage. So you might not really, like, budget data by itself doesn't immediately scream procurement, but it is super important to be aware of what the budgets are, because that's kind of your bound of what procurement can happen in a financial period. And there's all kinds of other bits and pieces, and not necessarily all of these artifacts exist in every procurement process, like in every order or every case, but a lot of these should exist. And it's helpful to be able to ask the people who should have this data better questions of like using the terms that they might be using for these things. Do they have this? Can they share this? Why not? And your potential users as well. How do they currently access this? Are they aware that something like this should even exist? And how do they currently access it? And how can you then make that easier for them? It was so useful for me. I called it a safety blanket the other day. It gives me so much peace of mind to kind of structure this information this way, that when we made a guide to the procurement processes and legislation in South Africa for South Africa's National Treasury, we structure the content in that form. And it's also helpful to do that, to try and have everyone kind of speak the same language and use the same terminology for these things. What it's also been really helpful for is to identify where the gaps are. So I've just kind of horribly pasted on some annotations to this graphic from the Open Contracting Data Standard documentation, but the only one that's really, you could say, truly available is the budget data. Project plans are kind of available, but I'm not really believing that it's comprehensive. Procurement plans, sorry, that's procurement plans. Project plans I haven't really seen much of, except for press statements. Public hearing information is also available somewhere, but market studies I've never come across. Maybe they publish the odd one, but not in a structured place, like not in a place where you know you're going to get all of the studies here. Tender notices we know are available, but they're not centralized. I'm going to be talking a bit more about that. Specifications, line items, values, that stuff you only get by going to tender meetings generally, which means you might need to kind of hop on over to Joburg or hop on over to another city if you want to participate in procurement there, which isn't really feasible for everyone. So very quickly we can see that there are massive gaps in the data that would be very helpful if it was available, but isn't right now. And the big kind of elephant in the room a lot of the time is that contract information is not available, and that is so important for oversight. And the same with implementation. Payment data is kind of sort of available, but not identifying suppliers. Location information is kind of available for infrastructure projects, but not a lot of other stuff, and so on. So yeah, so I think that's the one part. Then I'm stopping short of saying go and use the Open Contracting Data Standard. I would rather encourage that you to take the principles from the standard, but don't get stuck trying to implement the standard from day one. One of the principles that I really value in the documentation of the Open Contracting Data Standard is don't wait for complete data. Just publish what you have, and you can always publish updates to your to the data as you get more information. It's part of the procurement process that as time goes by, as the procurement process goes further along the stages, more information becomes available. And it's completely expected around the world from experience that comprehensive information, not every attribute is always going to be available for a range of reasons. The other big point, I think, is that, and it might be controversial, but I would say that working tools are more useful than standards compliance. Rather make a tool that solves an actual problem for people than get stuck implementing a standard. But a data standard isn't a tool that someone can actually use now today to make their lives easier. You still need developers and people to kind of then build tooling on top of that. So learn from the standard, but focus on your use case. Focus on the problems that you're solving for users. And it's like, by all means, publish data in structured format, but it's not that hard once you have data in structured format to transform it into the right shape. So don't stress about it. Like and of course try and be compliant or almost compatible or something like that. But don't get stuck on the standards and stuff like that. Demonstrate that you're aware of the standard because it helps people take you seriously. But yeah. So looking at an example then. Tender data, I said, is probably one of the pieces of the big procurement data puzzle that is most available. Some tenders, so in South Africa, some tenders are available at etenders.gov.za. That is National Treasury's tender website. It's not comprehensive and it's a pain to use. Some tenders are available in government gazettes or tender bulletins, and that's basically like a newspaper published by government that gets published as PDFs, and you can probably get paper copies as well, not exactly structured data. Some tenders are available on the entity websites like the departments, the municipalities, the public entities, and their agencies. So as an example, National Treasury is a national department in South Africa. It has, I guess you can call them agencies or sub-units, the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer and the and GTAC and a number of other kind of sub-units, each with their own procurement pages. So even within a department, you don't have kind of centralized procurement data. And then tenders are also published in the newspaper. So we know people access tenders because every day people are bidding on tenders, but it's not centralized. It's not generally not structured data. There are 41 national departments. There are 122 provincial departments. There are 278 municipalities, and there are 175 public entities, and there are many state-owned enterprises. I think 700 and something. So consider starting, like, make sure that whatever you're doing doesn't rely on you having comprehensive data, because that's just not realistic. Consider speaking to, like, finding a bit of a niche or focusing on a small number of entities where you can build relationships, access good quality data, refine a product or an offering or a tool that where you can actually now demonstrate what you can do with it. And when you've got something to demonstrate, you can continue building those relationships and getting access to more data and so on. But don't expect that. And there's a lot of business of trying to not step on each other's toes in government. So it's very hard for government to compel other parts of government to supply data. It doesn't happen overnight. So you're not going to just blanket get data because you've unlocked some kind of a light bulb has gone on in someone's minds. That's not how this is going to work. It's certainly not how it's worked with the open data work we've done with government. So it's not going to, just having a good offering isn't going to kind of unlock that data. It's going to be a slow process where you need to build relationships, build trust, demonstrate, like, deal with people's fear and uncertainty, all of that stuff. So start somewhere where you can actually make some progress and then build out from there. Continuing with tender data, yeah, so I've mentioned getting complete data is hard, it's unrealistic. There's a lot of data in PDFs, but scraping from PDFs is hard. And just because you can do it now doesn't mean you can do it next week or next month when they change the format, because they're formatting this for humans to see and read. They might be doing it in Word. You never know how it's going to come out. So if you want to build something sustainable, be very careful of thinking you're going to do that on a process where you're exporting data from PDFs. Even though that might be a nice way to seed an initial set of data to kind of develop an idea, consider then fixing your data pipeline at the source. That means building a relationship with whatever the source of that data is and offering them something that makes it so compelling to them that they will share that structured data with you, the structured information. Potentially that might mean you need to change their business practices, their practices of capturing this information. And that's hard again. And there might be challenges to getting in there because they might suspect that you're trying to influence things in weird ways. They might not understand how you can help them. There might be procurement processes that need to happen. You might need to competitively bid to be a service provider of whatever is this tooling that's going to be capturing this information, or where that they might use to capture this information. So you become, you need to participate in procurement yourself. So it's very good for you to be well aware of what does this practice look like internally in reality. And then what are the sort of their considerations and concerns that aren't necessarily technical that influence how they might decide to change the practices and capture that information in a structured way, so that you can end up with structured data that can help you solve some kind of problem. So yeah, I've mentioned don't think you'll be comprehensive from day one, and start in some corner of the world where this information is fairly available, and then expand out from there. And then I think, yeah, on the other side, don't rely on exclusive access to data for competition. Don't think that if you're competing with someone else doing something similar, that you're going to be the only one with this data, and that is your advantage, because they can get access to that data any day through some relationship that they have, or through that light bulb going on eventually, and some decision maker in government deciding, oh, I'm going to make this information available now. And if that's what your business model was based on, then you're in big trouble. And I'd also say, share what you have as structured data, because over time we can then centralize and aggregate from all of these different potential places where structured data is being, where partial structured data is being published. Once it's structured, it's at least easier to consolidate and bring it together, and then have a nice, rich central source of data. And I think by making the public data accessible, you're forcing yourself not to rely on your exclusive access to this data. You're forcing yourself to develop a tool or an idea or a product that actually provides value on top of the data, and that should put you in a very healthy position as a business or as an organization. And I think Gabby will talk more about the business side, but I think it's worth enough mentioning under just accessing data. And if you're publishing the data that you have in ways that other people can use, I think you're benefiting yourself. You're benefiting everyone, but you're benefiting yourself in the long run, because you're accelerating a move to transparent e-procurement, which I think just means that there are more opportunities for different organizations that might focus on different niches from you to develop their things, and it's creating an ecosystem where e-procurement is really a thing that's happening, where it's been a long slog, and I think it's going to continue to be quite a long slog to try and make it a reality. So the more this data starts getting made available as it is, as people have their hands on it, the more quickly we can get to a place where this is actually something feasible and actually something people trust and believe in. So a few learnings, well, from one case really, of where we fairly recently got our hands on kind of contract data, orders that have been placed. So these aren't advertised tenders. They're beyond awarded tenders. Sometimes there are references to contract numbers and quantities, sometimes kind of specifications. So when COVID happened, the president declared that there must be the orders for personal protective equipment must be made public by all of national and provincial government. So the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer made this page where for every provincial department, there was a PDF. Sometimes it was the same one PDF for a whole province. Sometimes it was one PDF for each department. Sometimes there was multiple PDFs for different departments. All they said was these properties need to be published. This is an example of one of those PDFs where but I mean, a different department might look entirely differently and publish different fields. So the point I want to get to with this is to be pragmatic. And if there's, so what everyone wanted to do with this is they wanted to automatically find where the corruption is happening. We knew corruption was going to happen, and they wanted that corruption to be shown. They wanted charts and graphs and beautiful things with it, but this is the data we had. So I'm going to get to this in the end, but be pragmatic. If there's an easier, useful problem to solve, do that. So what we did was we scraped those PDFs, over 100 files, and sometimes we had to OCR them and do a whole range of things. What I wanted to show here was that sometimes you would get an order amount, which is the value of the total order, so many masks, this much money. Sometimes you get a payment amount, but there might be multiple payments on one order. So you don't necessarily know whether this was one order or multiple, one payment, like a part payment or a complete payment. And sometimes you would have both of these fields. Sometimes you would have a cost per unit, sometimes you wouldn't, and you might be able to calculate cost per unit based on order amount, depending on how good the quantity information was. So what we decided to do was to just try and create a data model that can capture whatever information is available, learning from the Open Contracting Data Standard. And the way we named a lot of these fields was kind of informed by the OCDS, but this is far from Open Contracting Data Standard. We just try to capture what we have in a structured form, not interpret too much into the data, just capture it, because what we could feasibly do was to provide a search interface that shows the data that we have. So if we don't have data about a certain order, we don't show that field. If we do have data in that field, we show it. But each of these orders for different buyers, this is Department of Education, national, this would be National Home Affairs, and this is one municipality. They publish totally different structures of data, different sets of fields, but at least we could make it easy to search for masks or search for a particular supplier name or a particular manufacturer or a particular specification, if that specification was in there. Just to make it a little bit easier so that someone doesn't have to trawl through over 100 PDFs, they can now just search for that and see what comes up. So there's still a lot of analysis work that has to happen after people can get this, but we could make it a little bit smoother. And you can download all the data, so you can get all of the data as it was published, just in a structured form instead of PDFs, if you click this download matches thing. So if this wouldn't have happened, there wasn't enough time or funding to make something where you can have dashboards and charts, because when you have such partial data, any kind of visualizations need so many caveats to say, well, yeah, but this doesn't cover all the orders. So if we say that the total order, the total payments is so much, you never know how much overlap there was, how much duplication there was, and it wouldn't necessarily be helpful. Someone would have to actually filter through the data and identify those problems and deal with those problems, clean the data, and that wasn't going to happen. So if we wanted to get something out the door, we needed to lower our ambition and just make something basic available. So if there's a simpler problem you can solve than what you originally set out to do, and there's a risk that you're not going to solve that original problem, just solve the easy one. Get that out. Do something that changes the world, and then you can build on top of that. So my last thoughts then: getting data takes relationships. Getting our hands on this data in this case didn't take relationships, but someone had to influence the president to do that. But generally speaking, getting our hands on data takes relationships. It takes some time. You have to get to know people, and even if you're not getting to know people and that way convincing them to make data available to you, it takes at least 7 phone calls. First, you get to the switchboard and they're not helpful. You call the switchboard again and you ask better questions and you get through to someone. And that someone doesn't have the data and isn't really sure how they can help you. But if you're persistent, they might transfer you to someone else. And if you keep doing that and just trying to figure out what the arrangement is of people and desks and roles in the organization or the government entity where you're trying to get the data from. If you're lucky, you end up at that data nerd somewhere in the organization that is just happy for someone to use the data that they've painstakingly collected. So don't be disheartened if at first, or after the second phone call, after the third phone call, you haven't got data yet. The reality, time and again, of getting access to data is 7 phone calls. So yeah, I think those are the thoughts from me. Should I keep presenting, Gabby, or do you want to present?
I'll present. Sorry,
Okay.
I've put on a very thick coat because I got really cold. We're just going to have to deal with that collaboratively as a team.
Now I need to figure out how to make you host, hey?
It's just easier.
Done.
I was trying to find for you guys, because I know Corruption Watch just launched their new Procurement Watch tool, which I haven't had a chance to play on yet, and it looks closed for some reason. I think you have to get a login or something. But I'll share it with everyone once we have more information. So just you can look around on it. Let me make sure I don't share the wrong thing. Okay. Yeah, so I suppose, you know, the gist, and I'm sure you all know this, of what JD is saying, and similarly kind of a theme of what I'll say too, is that, it obviously depends on eventually what your product looks like. But, in our experience, the hard work is not in the technology development, really. Most of your energy will be depending on the product again, but the hard work's in the data, which I suppose is an aspect of development, but sometimes undercosted and underappreciated, and in the sort of relationship building and politics around these kinds of initiatives. And I think you need to bear that in mind, not just from a strategy perspective, but from how you literally cost your business practices. You need to make sure you understand that those are very human intensive and labor intensive kinds of activities. And those need to be costed for. We're obviously coming from a sort of MPO background, but I think a useful element for understanding, just as an introduction to your business development, is understanding that, in this space, the sort of space somewhere in between sort of, private sector development and technology development for good, we sometimes adopt languages from different environments that cause some confusion, or at least cause some divergences in focus. And that there are often differences between users, beneficiaries, stakeholders, clients that we don't think about. And I think a big thing in this space, which is quite unusual, is that frequently your user won't be the same thing as your client, and where your client is the source of your funds. But yet, it's still vitally important for technology development to be able to center your user in the design process if you want a product that actually works or delivers on what it says it will do. And in that kind of user-centered development, understanding the behaviors and incentives of your users is really, really important. But within our context, you have to appreciate, those digital divide issues, that it depends on who you're trying to, again, who your product is trying to reach. But, we have significant variances in both just literally digital access and internet access, as well as unstable internet access, as well as expensive data costs across the continent, highly inflated for a lot of reasons. But also there are huge divergences and inequalities in terms of digital capacities and digital skills. And understanding that, because of these inequalities, a lot of people, it depends again on your model, but you mustn't underestimate how few digital natives we kind of have, and that means a heavy investment into thinking about your UI and your UX in your product development as well, because these are barriers that can be overcome, but they have to be remembered in your design. When you move more to sort of a social impact model, there's also the issue of your beneficiaries, who are like the people you ultimately want to benefit from your activities. That will often be much wider than your users and much wider than your stakeholders. So, the general public whose lives will be improved by more efficient procurement, the government whose, objectives will be furthered by having more efficient procurement systems that allow for better delivery, but understanding beneficiaries is very, very important for trying to understand how to compartmentalize and package your impact. And that becomes important for your monitoring and evaluation, learning, but also can be an important thing for your business model, which I'll touch on. It depends which way you kind of go. But again, you sort of need to think about differential access, differential internet, to think about what the ultimate benefit of your product can be, even at scale. Then, stakeholders, this is, often 90% of the job, in any project is managing the different stakeholders involved who are necessary in order to move on the project surrounding your product. Often in this kind of space, that will include government stakeholders who require it's a very particular kind of environment, and over time you'll develop the skills you need to do that. But you have to remember the different interests of all the parties involved, and that's why project management is such an important part of a lot of your activities. Again, something that needs to be costed for, because that stakeholder management is a very important part of project success, even and in the long-term potential impact. Then you have your clients, now whoever that is. So it depends on your business model, but remember that's often not your user in our kind of space, which is quite unusual. So, you need to think about how you can align the interests of your users with the interests of your clients and your own interests in forwarding a kind of an impact that you want to have. So even though these are procurement projects, if at any stage you envision government as a client, you yourself will need to become privy with the machinations of government procurement processes from that side, which is its own interesting beast. Okay. This is a little stakeholder management cheat sheet. It's something that we like to think about. And it's just, to remember that you have your own objectives, which align with your partners. But they also sometimes will diverge. And as a team, being very clear on where there are those divergences from day one is a very important part of your project implementation. And so I just thought I'd flag that. I know probably all very experienced in implementing your own projects, but I think in this kind of space where, again, it depends on the stakeholder we're talking about, but it's not a politically neutral space at all. It's a very politicized space for various reasons. And I think trying to think of practical strategies for managing that as an organization is very important. So what are your potential business models? I mean, there are a lot more experienced people to talk about, startup business models than me. And I have very much, the perspective of someone coming from a sort of nonprofit kind of space. But one of the early cautions I give is, I think sometimes you should design your business model in response to the impact and value add you want to have, and not necessarily the other way around. So, my organization, for instance, uses a kind of a mixed model of funding. We get both grant funding from, nonprofit grant making institutions, and we get what are not called revenue projects, but essentially project funding from both private and government clients to develop projects in line with our constitution. And I put that as number 3, but I'm starting there because that's our experience. And I think with any of your business models, you're going to have to answer questions quite early on about your structure. So in other words, your legal and organizational structure, and what the requirements are in each of your jurisdictions, and whether there are any limitations to the kinds of funds you can receive based on your structure. But yeah, one of the things we're increasingly in our kind of mixed model exploring is, accessing private sector funds, both as clients, but also as grant revenue in the form of corporate social responsibility funds, which is, an option. But again, it depends on what your value add is. So what is the value add that you're centering your business on? But in following that kind of mixed model, we've diversified our product offerings. So in other words, we find it very useful to do training as well as digital products. So like WaziMap, we productize one of our products that we're able to white label to different companies. But yeah, they don't underestimate the value of your knowledge as a kind of product that's for sale. There would be a suggestion in that regard, so training, consulting, those kinds of things, because those tend to be short term and don't necessarily distract you from your core work. But again, that's if you follow a mixed model. In terms of like pure grant funding, it's a very competitive environment. It's quite time consuming, but this is why it becomes important to think about what I said earlier about your beneficiaries, because I think if you do want to pursue grant funds, then, and also private sector corporate social responsibility funds, being able to compartmentalize your impact is very, very important. So in other words, being able to clearly articulate and explain how your work leads to certain impacts and outcomes directly is a very big selling point in a kind of grant funding model. In the region, I mean, it depends on the sector, but the idea of kind of individual donors or crowdfunding, like a Patreon kind of model, is not very realistic. Certainly not for projects in this kind of governance space. It's different with, more service-based kinds of initiatives, like that people can easily translate. So in other words, food donations. I know someone gets X amount of food. I know someone gets a house. those kinds of forms of social impact work often fit better in that kind of individual donor model, but that's also requires quite a lot of management. And it's a very particular kind of skill to fundraise through that. In terms of kinds of revenue funding, you know, again, if you following a sort of a straight sort of private sector form of revenue funding, you know, again, you just need to remain aware of the differences between the impact you want to have and the interests of your client. There are often divergences between those two things. Then you need to figure out what your, you know, whether you follow a subscription model, do you do limitation on the seats within a subscription, do you, you know, like, you know, that kind of software as a service business model. And again, as you, whatever business model you decide to pursue, you have to capacitate in terms of human resources for that business model. You know, each of these different models has a particular set of skills that you need in order to manage it effectively. So many slides. I want to leave it open for questions. So I'm just going to touch on something which I call why data is not the new oil here. And this is one of my preachy speeches. I mean, we are an open data organization, but you know, there are many reasons why I think any kind of model based on a proprietorial data model isn't worth your time, particularly in this kind of space where the likelihood is you will be heavily reliant on public data. Data is generally, it depends on your jurisdiction, but data is generally not copyrightable as a fact, although data sets can have a certain amount of copyright invested over them through sweat of the brow, those kinds of, let me not get into that legal schmeagle stuff, but basically, you know, there are significant costs to trying to create data moats and defend data proprietarily. And I think in the context, this kind of context, that model doesn't make any sense. And rather to contribute to an ecosystem around good open procurement data is a better way to go. You know, don't underestimate the costs of defending a data moat. And there are reasons why even a lot of private sector clients, you know, Andreessen and Horowitz even did an article on you know, don't overestimate the value of proprietorial attitudes to data. So I think I ended there. Yes, I'm going to end there so that we have time for questions. Sorry if I skipped anything. Thanks.
Thanks so much,
I stole
JD,
too much
and
time.
thanks that's okay. Thanks so much, JD and Gabriella. So we'll open it up to questions. Are there any questions from anyone? I didn't get any via email, so feel free to jump in and ask questions.
Yeah, quick one from me. It's Eliud in Nairobi, Kenya. So my question is to Gabriella. And thank you so much for the presentation, both of you. I think that was very insightful. Loved it. But my question is, now when we are doing this, most of us, especially in my group, we are relatively young. And so that definitely means we are limited when it comes to experience. And so most of the time we're just like, it's trial and error, right? So we've not really figured out things as much as you may think. And we're getting into this anyway because we have the fire in us. We just like we have to get it done because we know we have to do something about this corruption nightmare. Now, when it comes to the business model specifically, even from your experience, do you feel like there's actually room for trying something then changing much later? Or is it like you definitely have to figure it out from the onset? Or is there really room to change your business model at some point when you just realize maybe this is not working? So can I, like, you mentioned some 3 versions of a business model that you can work with. Do you actually have room? Do we actually have room to try all of them and see what works?
Yeah, I mean, I just laugh because I mean, we're constantly experimenting and changing our direction. So, I mean, that's perfect. You're already doing everything perfectly by my estimation. There are some practical limitations that you might have to think about, simply in terms of like governance. So it depends on the country, but you'll have to look into it, you know, whether you set up as a non-profit company or whether you set up as a commercial company, or whether you set up as, say, I mean, some places still have an NGO as a separate category. You must just explore in your country what the limitations are in terms of funding, what kind of funding you can receive, for instance. So as an example, we're actually a voluntary association. I'm a lawyer, so I was very sneaky in our design, but we're a voluntary association rather than a non-profit company, which basically doesn't limit us much, except all the work we undertake has to be pursuant to our constitution, which is fine. You know, there's structures you can put in place to make sure you never take on a project that goes outside those boundaries. But also there's not just the sort of registration kind of issue, there might be tax implications, which is something you'd have to explore as well as part of your, it's when you're trying to decide how to incorporate, basically, you know, the incorporation question. So we get, as a non-profit, we get, but it might be different, but as a non-profit, we get a tax exemption. So our income isn't taxed. But there is a limitation that, of course, in order to maintain that tax exempt status, we cannot accumulate profit. Do you know what I mean? And what is profit in a different situation is different things to different people. But you know, those are some of the like cautionary flags that you just need to explore. You know, so tax, incorporation, if there are any limitations in your incorporation. In terms of, you know, when you think about your business model in relation to, you know, the strategy for actually bringing in income, I think you have to be flexible. Do you know what I mean? We originally, so we do, one of our core programs is Co-Bridge Youth, where we essentially work with youth in different communities and use data and digital literacy training to actually get them sort of politically active. So and as part of our inspiration for active citizenship, right? Great, you know, like a nice normal kind of CSO kind of activity. We realized that that's actually marketable as a product. So there is a way for us to offer establishing a youth summit, establishing a youth council, doing 2 workshops, that we can actually productize it and offer it to different stakeholders. So municipalities that might have youth funds. We just offered it in a community in Namibia where a mining company had corporate social responsibility funds and wanted to work with its you know, youth community. So essentially, do you know what I mean? Compartmentalize it, which is like really interesting shift. But, you know, so we don't accumulate any profit, although we do, you need to, at the same time, find a way to have cash reserves for cash flow. But, you know, as long as all my staff are paid, we're all happy. No, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, I also just wanted to quickly jump in and also, first of all, thank you. Well, thank the both of you for very insightful presentations. Maybe first just double checking, Gabriella, you said something in the lines of data is not the oil here, right? I'm not so sure if I understood you correctly. Would it be, do you mean it in the sense that it's not sufficient to just be here trying to publicly avail or make more available data which up until now has been hidden, you know, and then allowing that to serve as an empowerment tool to the citizens, you know, to just first of all be informed, and second also maybe even vet some of the decisions that are made regarding state funds? Or did you mean it in the sense that we need not stop at data, but go beyond that? Essentially, I guess I'm really asking you, if data is not the oil, what is the oil here? Because what you're trying to get to is the oil. Yeah. I mean, it could also be that you mean, is it more in the efficacy or in the efficiency of the tools that we develop around data? I just wanted if you could shed some more light in that. I thought it made sense coming from someone that has already been in the sphere for some time. So it would be good if you could expand a little bit on that as well. Thanks.
Sorry, no problem. It's part of a very long speech I usually give on data and really about proprietary models in relation to data. You know, the statement that data is the new oil, I think, is exceptionally, it touches on, you know, how central data is to business models, and data is a factor of production often, right? Data is generated from producing, which is very different to oil. So it's like basically, you know, that saying data is the new oil. Part of the problem is then people think about data as in terms of being an asset similar to oil. So in other words, that if I just accumulate enough of it and I box it, you know, that's a business model for me. And meanwhile, you know, how we generate value from data economically, but also socially and politically, but economically, is to actually have the capacities to use that data effectively, to have the technologies that can use that data effectively, and to have the business strategies that can use that data more effectively, you know, for your outcomes. And it becomes it's not a small point, because often you know, I've been working with Sierra Leone government on its data strategy. I work with the African Union on its data policy. You know, understanding data as a thing that can be boxed off is a fundamental mistake for the broad strategy in relation to data, you know, because if you don't, you know, it's also understanding data as a thing, you know, as a static thing built into data sets actually, and not appreciating, you know, the role of access to real-time data that in fact affects like data in a digital economy, even if it's not really the same in our context, right? We are talking about data and data sets and we love them. But so that was the point. Sorry, it's usually part of another speech I do in strategy.
All right, no, that clears it for me. Thanks.
I think Gina was about to say something. Did you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, So I wanted to ask the different types. Was using an example saying she joined as a something representative and NGO. What are the differences?
Between like well, it depends on the jurisdiction. Where are you based?
South Africa.
Oh, South Africa. Okay. Well, in South Africa, you have, so we used to have NGOs as like a kind of like we used to have closed corporations, but anyway. So you had an NGO and as having sort of a different legal status but now you have something called a non-profit company, which is a company that's managed under the Companies Act, but that's not for profit. But you can still actually be a community-based organization or voluntary association that's registered with the Department of Social Development. And then is the statute that oversees you or regulates you is the non-profit Act. Now, if you're a non-profit company, you're subject to both the Non-Profit Act, the one with the DSD, the Department of Social Development Act, and the Companies Act. We're not registered as a non-profit company because of the compliance burden, although we have the same governance structure as is recommended under the Companies Act. So we have a board that meets however long, many times a year, you know, and we have financial systems that function very much like most corporate companies. But it was just to relieve us of the compliance burden. So we're established as a voluntary association of members.
Is there any way we can access this data just to read up and get clued up for ourselves?
Yeah, they're too good, but again, it'll only be South Africa because might be different. And what else do I know about the two? I'll say there's something called NGO Law, who provide legal services and advisory roles, but Inyatelo is an entity, I'll put it up here, who sort of provide general advice. They're actually, they've been around for ages, and they provide general advice on kind of non-profit organizations. So that's a good place to start for, you know, free information. I mean, the thing is also not to get, you know, the compliance stuff, you can get really bogged down in it. Yeah, but to find a model and just kind of run with it is, you know, sometimes the easiest way to go. I think, yeah, again, it depends on if you think there's going to be any part of your offering that just will rely completely on private sources of funds, then it's worth establishing as a company. But remember, a non-profit company basically means, it doesn't mean people can't, either being an NPO or a non-profit company, it doesn't mean that people can't get salaries. It means you cannot accumulate profit that gets distributed to shareholders. That's basically what it means. So you can't have shareholders. So that's a limitation in this kind of environment because of, you know, like investors, startup investors, a lot of whom, you know, part of that model in the startup environment is to, you know, invest in an organization in exchange for shares. You know,
Sorry,
so
Gab,
that's,
Yeah.
do you see a prompt to invite people from the lobby?
ah, shit. Sorry.
I just ignored it before.
Yeah, me too. Someone else is always dealing with it.
So
Luckily,
sorry,
there's a
that's my bad. I made you both hosts instead of a co-host, so Zoom
Yeah.
mistake. It is only 6 a.m. here in DC, so I'm still waking up.
Full forgiveness.
I was concerned when I saw the time.
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah, so that's the, sorry. just to say that's the big limitation to think about. Like, do you want startup funds? In which case, you know, you're probably going to have to establish yourself as a company because of the share issue. Or if you're going to try and rely on a mixed model, then it's different. And, you know, there are a lot of kind of VC kind of funds that do invest in social responsibility projects, but that wouldn't be a main source of income. But here, I mean, in other countries, there is a kind of a particular structure for social entrepreneurships, you know, and I'm not sure if anybody in the room, they might want to explore if in their countries there is like a social entrepreneurship kind of structure, formal structure, you know, with oversight. But in South Africa, there's not. There's a non-profit company really, or an NGO or a company.
Thank you. I think we'll just do further research just to understand the differences and advantages and disadvantages there.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I maybe just come in again and ask a question to JD? I know you spoke about some of the challenges around data. You, at some stage, you mentioned the difficulties with parsing data which was available as PDF. And yeah, I think I have some experience in that as well. You can pass it today, but maybe not so much next week anymore. I was wondering, has it crossed your thought that as one tries to I don't know, maybe collate or just gather some of this information that makes sense to the idea or the product that you're basically trying to push out, that instead of relying or instead of maybe just building your capacity to handle whatever it is that you receive, but that you look into maybe even changing it from the source end, you know, in the sense that, say, for instance, you spoke of the e-tenders portal for the government in South Africa, that one would approach these as, first of all, an exercise of bringing e-tenders.co.za or .za up to standard so that it conforms to the open forget that name, the contracting data standards. And if you have already thought of that, maybe just some ideas from your side. What was the reception like, or the feedback from the stakeholders in that area?
Yeah, how deep does the tunnel go? So you have to let's say we want to improve how data is published at the e-tender portal. It's a website. I think it's a PHP website. Previous iteration was Drupal or something. They obviously have a database of this stuff, and somehow things are getting into that database. But I think, and because it's a website, I can in theory build a scraper, or if I don't know, I think it has an API, so I can in theory query its API and get structured data out of it. But I think a bigger problem than that is that I don't think it has all the data, because generally when I see a tender elsewhere, just out of interest, I quickly check if it's on the tender portal, and I haven't really managed to see tenders that I see elsewhere there. I don't spend a lot of time looking at tenders, but I am very convinced that it's not comprehensive. And so now there's organizational and structural reasons why everyone who's supposed to be publishing there, each of the 278 or whatever municipalities, each of the national departments and all of their agencies, everyone is supposed to be, I mean, the regulation says that they're supposed to make their tenders available, and I think they're currently interpreting it as either in the Gazette or in the e-tender portal. But I know the intent is that the e-tender portal is supposed to be comprehensive. So why are they not putting their tenders there? So what I would do next, and we just haven't really had it hasn't come to the top of our pile of things we're pursuing, is to go to another national department and say, well, I see this tender is on your website, but not on the e-tender portal. Why is that? Is it because it's hard? Is it because you don't see the value in it? Is it because, I mean, they're not going to answer this, but is it because If you publish it in a smaller place, then it's easier for you to have your friends bid, but not have everyone bid. So you need to figure out why that's happening, and it could be for technical and non-technical reasons. And so when you say go to the source, I would go further to the source and then go look inside that organization and see maybe the person who's supposed to be doing it just didn't realize. There are things in terms of opening up data that can help to bring attention to the gaps. Like I use the Open Contracting Data Standard to kind of map out what's available. So IBP, the International Budget Partnership, monitors what budget data is published by countries around the world and publishes rankings. Now it's imperfect because ultimately you need to have people who aren't experts in the data kind of I'd verify what gets shared with them. But you do end up with in aggregate, a fairly accurate map of what data is available, and when something becomes unavailable next year, you can flag that. So you can do the same with tender data and try and do some kind of nice reporting of which departments are publishing and which departments are not publishing at all on the eTender portal, and just shine a light on those gaps. And then which ones are publishing unusually little for the amount of work that they're doing, what you might expect. But I think at the end of the day, if we wanted to make fairly comprehensive, high quality data available, we have to look into those organizations. And that is why I say you can't get away from building those relationships, getting to know them, and you can't just go in and expect straight answers when it might feel like it's going to be embarrassing to them and you're just trying to help them. But you have to kind of slowly build trust to be able to get those real answers of, oh no, the person who's supposed to be uploading it to the eTender portal literally just didn't know that they're supposed to do it. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. No, I'm glad you actually mentioned, or you mentioned the challenge that we also exactly trying to think of how we would try to overcome, that there's a central place where everything is supposed to be flowing, but compliance is just not there. Then 500, 200, 100 other people, they also do their own little thing, and bringing all of that under the same roof is then a challenge. But thank you for those suggestions. I think we'll consider that.
One thing to flag just before we go off is, it obviously depends on what your business depends. Such a loyal answer to everything. It depends, but don't underestimate the opportunities at local government as well. I think thinking about local government as a really important site for procurement and procurement practice, and thinking about how to work at that level. I think, in our experience, there's a lot more opportunity there for collaboration, depending again on what you're trying to look for. And yeah, I just flagged to not forget that it's there. The idea of like one grand national system is, an ideal, but there are lots of opportunities to do some very transformative work at local government that we're constantly exploring, and we'd really encourage you to explore as well.
And I want to refer back to something Gabby said, which was to try and align the interests of your clients or your stakeholders, your users, and your own. So if you can, I think a lot of people don't care about the Open Contracting Data Standard, and a lot of people who are talking a lot about the Open Contracting Data Standard don't realize that that's not necessarily the thing that is the blocker, the thing is standing in the way of what we're trying to achieve. So if what you're trying to achieve is having this information out in the open, and what a municipality wants to achieve is to stimulate their local economy, to have cost-effective procurement, like value for money,
to be voted for next
to
election.
Be voted for, figure out what they want, and the people who you need to have on your side, figure out what they want, and then figure out how you can align that and what you want to achieve, and to demonstrate to them how when they allow you to do what you're trying to achieve, that can actually support what they're trying to achieve, that can open doors for you. And that is also called lobbying. It's not lobbying with expensive watches and dinners and stuff like that, but it is just understanding what different people want and how you can kind of let them see that when your interests align, everyone wins. And you can maybe give, like, not even claim the success publicly, claim the success to your funders, but let them claim that they are so amazing at opening up information, blah, 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 get re-elected, because they have done a good thing, right? They have improved transparency, supported oversight, stuff like that.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for a really incredible and insightful presentation. Really appreciate your insights both on kind of technical build out and a business development model. I think this has been really helpful. And I know a lot of our young participants are working, so we're going to make sure to forward this video and your presentation to everyone so that they can have a look. And yeah, we look forward to hopefully keeping in contact with you as we build out some of these ideas, because I think this has been really helpful. So thank you both for your time and for your effort on this workshop.
It's a pleasure. It's really interesting to, hear what everybody is up to. We get really excited. So it's really nice for us.
Yeah, we're very excited. So we've got a little more than a month building up here to the boot camps. So we've got a bit more time to put in some more work and thought here.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Take care, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Bye.
All the best.